So just quickly about me, I'm an engineering manager here at mabl. Been with the team about 1.5 years, but I've done software development for many years. And a fun fact about me is that I was a mabl user first before and I joined the team. And so a few topics that I'm going to be covering today. So I'm going to talk about why intelligent end-to-end testing is so important, and especially important to user experience and the impact that it has on that. I'll also talk about some strategies for building effective end-to-end testing in mabl, and especially how API testing can really fit into and level up your testing strategy. And so I want to start with this quote that I came across recently, and it was really, I think, the inspiration for a lot of this presentation. It's from a gentleman named Shep Hyken. He's a customer experience expert and now speaker. And what I really like about it is it really pushes us to broaden, what we think of is a part of user experience and customer experience. So it's to every interaction. It's not just interacting with your web application. And sometimes it's not even the parts that your user can see. It's really end to end. It's everything. And I think that's a really powerful shift in perspective when you're thinking about how to test those experiences. And so, why does this matter? Well, user experience really is a major differentiator for software teams. A couple data points here that I think are really interesting that we found. Purchasers, 86% of purchasers willing to pay more for a better experience. Over 80% of companies compete on customer experience alone. And over a majority of employees, over 50% of employees are unhappy at work because of the software that they use. And it's not just that experience is important, but users' expectations of what those experience should be is so much higher. So they're expecting that your app will work across multiple browsers and devices and work well, that they'll incorporate all these different touch points that a lot of times are relying on APIs, and that they are transparent and work seamlessly, that incorporates a lot of different forms of content into that experience. And not to mention that a lot of applications, especially mabl, are typically built on third-party services and software. It really makes it the foundation of how that application works. But testing these experiences can be really hard. You can try to do it using fully browser-based tests. They tend to be easier to create, but that can lead to tests that are much longer and slower and ultimately less reliable. Also, the reliance on third-party software introduces a lot of new risks in testing. So if your test involves interacting with a third-party UI, and that the user experience there changes unexpectedly, suddenly you have this test that's failing for nothing to do with your application, and that just doesn't feel right. And you can try a more divided approach, so testing parts of your customer and user experience in different pieces. But that can make your team a lot less efficient. It could lead to lower test coverage overall. You might be duplicating your testing efforts instead of broadening them. And it also can hurt collaboration between your development team, your quality teams, and that's not great either. But it doesn't have to be this hard, and especially when you're using mabl. So let's go through some strategies for how to create effective end-to-end tests. And we'll do that by walking through an actual example of a test that the team I'm a part of that we were working on recently. So my team was working on an effort to migrate our authentication provider to a new one recently. And obviously authentication is an incredibly critical and important part of the mabl system. It powers our sign up, login, access to the app, access to different resources within that application. So incredibly important that we had great coverage for that. It also introduced it was mostly behind the scenes, but it introduced some additional changes into the user experience, the first time user experience that we had to account for. So the experience was broken up into, you could break it up into 4 key parts. So there's submitting this trial form here, where you're providing an email and a few other pieces of data. Once you submit that, you're opening the email that's sent, clicking on a link that will take you back into the application to set a password and complete the activation of your account. The very first thing we do once a user is logs in and lands in mabl, is we have them install the desktop application. You can't create test in mabl without that. And then finally, we encourage users to create their first test and go through that experience. So, really a key journey for us, in our product. And so one of the engineers on my team, Anya, was tasked with making some updates to some of the tests that cover this experience. And it was a really interesting one because it had a lot of fun touch points. So there's an email, generating an email, accessing that email, dealing with authentication, obviously, which was provided by a third party. Of course, the mabl web application, but also endpoints in our own API that didn't have any user experience UI associated with them. So really interesting case that kind of covers a lot of the things that you can do in mabl. So the very first thing that I would ask you to think about when you're creating any test in mabl is you really think about how to set yourself up for success. So, what that meant in this case with our example is, as I mentioned, authentication, an incredibly critical part of the system. So obviously we want to have very high test coverage, a really great suite of tests running on this flow all the time in different stages to ensure that, we're able to deploy, with high quality and a lot of confidence. Additionally, we have a lot of tests that are already testing this flow, existing tests that we couldn't go and change because they would break for the current flow while we're working on this new one. So, how do we deal with that? There's a lot of great ways in mabl. Our deployment process, we already have this great process of you open up a pull request in GitHub with your changes, and we immediately create these preview environments, which is basically just a new version of the app that you can, if you have a URL, you can interact with it, you can test with it. Makes it really easy to test changes as you're working on them. So we can load these environments and configure them in mabl and begin to run tests on them, including any new or updated tests, taking advantage of branching in mabl, which is a really great way of really isolating these changes. Additionally, labels are really helpful here to segment your tests, categorize them into different parts of functional parts of your application or by team. That really makes it easy to both organize your tests, but also run them in different ways. So, in our case, running all of our authentication related tests, from the CLI or, as a part of our deployment process. It's also really important and a best practice for us to be able to test these changes very early in the process. And API tests are a great way of doing this. With our team, and I'm assuming with a lot of other teams, we tend to build out our API and backend changes first, sometimes before we even start to work on the UI parts of it. So rather than wait until the UI is up and ready to be tested and hold off on writing tests until that point, a great strategy is to build out some API tests to start testing that right away. It's a great way to ensure that your APIs and any changes there are working correctly, but also a great way to really get your development team, your front-end engineers, back-end engineers, your quality team on the same page right away and understanding what the scope of these changes are. And as Dan was talking about yesterday, we have this awesome unified runner that really makes it easy to run mabl anywhere. So you can run, we take advantage of that all the time in terms of running these tests locally with the desktop app or in our CI/CD pipeline, taking advantage of the different integrations that mabl provides there. It's also really important to strike the right balance when you're creating tests. So again, going back a few slides, you could use a browser test, to fully test a lot of your end-to-end journeys, but that can make them quite long. And oftentimes that might mean testing other applications that aren't yours, third parties, or even other parts of your application that aren't really relevant to the scope of this test. And so it's really important to test a UI that really matters for that test. And there's a couple great ways to do that. Going back to our example of this onboarding experience that we're testing, as I mentioned, there's a part of that experience which is about installing the desktop app. In this case, that experience wasn't even really testable within mabl. It requires downloading our desktop app and installing it on the OS, loading it up, and you just can't do that within mabl right now. And so what we're able to do is ultimately it's just an API call to one of our endpoints to actually set a flag that records that the user has installed the application. So really easily and quickly, we were able to create a JavaScript step that gets the token that's stored for our UI application, and then a second step with an API request to actually set that flag. So in this case, we didn't have to deal with any of the UX around installing and opening the desktop app at all. We could do that all within our tests within mabl, just with those types of steps. Additionally, visit URL steps are a really great way to avoid testing parts of your application, navigation that again aren't really relevant to the test, the purpose of the test that you're creating. Oftentimes, the common pattern is logging into the application and then navigating somewhere, but a visit URL step is going to be a lot more reliable and just skips over those things that aren't really important. It's also really important to keep your test focused, and that means keeping out things that don't need to be in that test. And again, there are lots of great ways to do this, a few that we found and that we use. So the fact that you can just combine and mix API and browser tests in the same plan is incredibly powerful. It lets you take advantage of shared variables. So you could have some API tests that are executing certain behavior, such as an access token when you're talking about authentication, store that to a variable and then leverage that in other tests. So it really allows you to create modular tests that can be really focused on the things that matter. Additionally, plan stages can be really helpful here, especially if you have logic that you're using to stage some data for your test, create users, create other data, and then clean that up afterwards. Plan stages are a really great way of executing that type of logic. Another thing that's really key is you have this test, you have it running, running out. Maybe you've added it to a plan that's running regularly or is triggered from a deployment event. That's great, but running these tests at scale can introduce a lot of new challenges, especially if you're testing against a persistent environment. So you can imagine you're testing that when you create a user, that user is showing up in the list of users in mabl's team management view. But over time, if you continue to add those users without cleaning them up, your test is going to become a lot more complicated or even unreliable to now find that user in that list, especially if there's paging involved. And so it's really important to, when you're starting a test, that you're ensuring that you're starting with a clean state and starting in the expected state that you're looking for. So a couple of great ways to do that. As I mentioned, kind of set up and tear down logic is a great way. And this image here, the screenshot here is an example of a plan that we use. So we have these plans, we call them janitor plans or cleanup plans. that will run maybe once a day, and they execute a bunch of tests, which are just cleaning up data from previous test runs that we just don't need anymore, that could cause these UX issues. And a really great thing I want to highlight here, again, talking about API tests, is one of the huge advantages there is just how fast they run. So in this case, there's 2 stages here, but the browser test is, it's a lot longer. Generally, they have to load the browser, they have to find elements in the browser, so they're going to be slower by default. But these API tests, because they're just interacting with an API, can be incredibly fast and generally more reliable. So again, being able to mix API tests and browser tests in the same plan is incredibly powerful. Another great use of API test is really targeted at making it faster and easier to debug issues that your tests run into. Inevitably, there are going to be failures, but using API tests to isolate and identify, API tests to identify where those failures are coming from can be really powerful and make it really easy to track down and identify where that issue is happening from. So things like having an API test that verifies that your environment is up and running and reachable before executing a bunch of browser tests that may ultimately fail. You could just have one quick step that tells you that right away. They're also great for third-party interactions. Again, if the service that you're using has API access, using that is generally going to be easier, faster, more reliable, and also a great way to identify if that third-party service is having issues or if it's introduced regressions into your overall system. So going back to our example test here. So we created this test that's going through and validating this new user experience. It's running well. We feel great about it, but how do we really know that we're using it well, that we're doing a good job of using that test to release with confidence, to make sure that we are validating the behavior in our application, ensuring that's high quality before it goes out in front of customers? And that's really where a lot of the coverage capabilities within mabl are super important and valuable. As Dan, I think, again, mentioned yesterday, and probably a few other presenters, the release coverage feature was a feature my team had worked on as well relatively recently. And it's really great for looking at your overall suite of tests, or maybe a segment of those tests. So in our case, we might break it down by use labels to identify tests that deal with authentication, or tests that belong to our team or within the scope of ownership of our team. And then get a lot of really valuable insights about how those tests are operating, how those parts of the application are doing from a quality perspective. So are we covering all the things that we need to? Are there any gaps in that coverage? Do we have any flaky tests that are failing frequently, even if they're currently passing now? Have we introduced any performance issues into our application with recent changes? So this is a really valuable tool to be using during this process, where for a lot of the time we were incrementally shipping code behind the scenes for our authentication migration, and really needed to make sure that we weren't accidentally introducing any regressions into the overall system. Zooming out a little bit, it's not just testing to, we want coverage that's not just for the full end-to-end journey, but it's also incredibly valuable to be able to have coverage across different environments and scenarios that your users will be encountering. Going back to the quote earlier, it's every interaction with your application, with your company is an opportunity to really delight your customers. And so the faster that we can do that, the better our test coverage will be. So there's, again, great ways of doing this in mabl. It still amazes me that in a few minutes you can create a plan, add a bunch of tests to that plan, and then have it run against a bunch of different mobile web environments. Maybe the most common ones that your users might be using. That's really powerful to be able to take those existing tests and very quickly expand that coverage into different environments. Data tables is another great way to do that, and something that, especially with login and authentication, we take advantage of. So we have some tests that will go through a bunch of different login failure cases and verify that they're failing as we expect and showing users the correct helpful message. So again, another really powerful tool to let you expand coverage. And finally, and maybe most importantly, working as a team in mabl is really the main driver of how you can have a successful testing strategy. So recently, a few engineers on our team have been evaluating how accessible and approachable our configuration and setup in mabl was for new hires, new engineers, new quality engineers, the rest of the team. And it definitely turned up a lot of great patterns that we either were using or have started to use. So, again, things like labels, labeling by the feature group or the functional group or by teams, lets you not only organize your tests really well, but also be able to get insights in very focused ways and for different segments. Echo steps, another great one, really lets you create in-test documentation in a way, lets you break up that test and give someone who maybe is seeing it for the first time, a better understanding of what it's trying to do. One that I always forget all the time, renaming test steps. When you have the trainer open, you can double click on a step and add a different, more descriptive step description there. Incredibly easy and another great tool. And custom email prefixes if you're leveraging mabl email testing, mabl mail. You can assign a custom prefix that will let you differentiate different emails within your tests and make it easier to understand what's happening, especially if you're working with multiple emails. And then hopefully this is obvious, but the ability to reuse logic across different tests, different plans, incredibly important and a really key feature of mabl again. So something we take advantage of, being able to use reusable flows, capturing logic. For this example test I was walking through, I've been walking you through, I noticed that the logic to do a sign up within mabl was duplicated in a few places. So it's really simple to just pull that out into a flow and then use that in all the tests that needed to do that. Same with snippets and having modular reusable pieces of JavaScript that you need in your test. And with all of these, or with both of these, parameterizing super important. So parameterized flows make it easier to reuse across different environments. If you need to pass in different variables into those flows, and soon parameterized JavaScript steps, which are going to be a really incredible extension of that feature. And so finally, just wrapping things up here, a couple of key points that I hope you take away from this. The first is just how important end-to-end tests are to delivering great experiences and experiences that your users will love. Second, that an effective automated testing strategy has to be a few things. It has to be balanced. So balanced from a focus of those tests and performance standpoints, but also diverse in terms of taking advantage of all the rich tool set that mabl provides and really combining API tests and browser tests. So to really ensure that holistic end-to-end coverage, your tests really need to be balanced and diverse. And then finally, going back to working at mabl as a team, really success is dependent on the effort that you're putting in to use mabl with intention and planning and preparation and teamwork. So none of this, all the effort you put into it won't matter unless you're really being intentional about how you're using mabl and how you're using it with your team and making sure that you're setting up your whole team for success. And so that is it. And thank you again for listening today, and be happy to take any questions in the few minutes that we have left.
Thank you, Jeff. We do have a lot of questions in the chat. I will say, I'm sure we won't get to everyone, but hopefully we'll answer some questions. And if not, please feel free to reach out to Jeff or anybody on the mabl team with your specific questions that we don't get to. So one question that we have right now is, at what point in the process should I be running end-to-end tests?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Ideally, early and often, as I think I hit on, earlier in the presentation. So I think that's, again, one of the things that we've tried to provide in mabl is, the ability to run those tests, very early in the process, even as you're, in the development process and building out, the code and user experience. So, using the local runs in the desktop app, using mabl in your CI/CD pipeline, things like that. So the sooner that you can start testing those end-to-end experiences, the more confidence you're going to have that you're really delivering, a great high-quality experience.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more. So another one is, how should I decide what parts of a journey to include or exclude in my end-to-end test?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. That's a really good question. The short answer is it depends, and it will likely be different for everyone, for every team. I would encourage you to think about, the journey, the experience, and, what is the starting point to end point where your user is really seeing some kind of value, experiencing, taking away some value from your application, to kind of guide where to draw those lines. But from there, it's really balancing a lot of different trade-offs. So, how fast or slow your test runs, the longer it is, how likely it might be to fail, to be less reliable. And of course, trying to pull out anything that feels unrelated or could be shared across tests. So again, using API tests for interacting with third parties, or passing in shared variables when that makes sense. So taking advantage of a lot of those features to make your tests more modular will let you have better, more performant, more reliable tests within mabl.
Great. And one final question, Jeff. Does mabl allow you to extend end-to-end tests to email?
It does, yes. That was both incredibly valuable to this test of our new user experience, and also really easy to take advantage of the mabl mailbox, our mabl mailbox feature. So really, it's just creating a variable which generates a new email address, and then using that in the sign up form. And then adding another step to access that inbox and look at that email, in this case an activation email, assert that it's correct, access the body of that email, click the link. So really important tool in our toolbox, as email is a really important part of a lot of user experiences.